So The Clay Urn is a novel, a fiction novella, um, based on my experiences living in Israel and serving in the military between 1984 and about 1989, 1990. I graduated from Livingston High School, then I went to university down in New Orleans at Tulane. And I studied the Arab-Israeli conflict and history of the Middle East at Tulane. And I thought upon graduation, it would be interesting for me to uh, move to Israel at that point in my life. That was my decision. And I didn't give it too much thought, perhaps because when you're only 22, we're not giving things full thought, or I should say, sometimes our knee-jerk reaction takes precedent over everything else. So anyway, I went there. I moved there with the intention to stay for a while to teach. And then a year later, I was drafted. All Israelis serve. I'm Jewish. So as somebody who is Jewish, moving to Israel, you become a citizen after a year. And as soon as I became a citizen, I had to serve. I volunteered for an infantry unit. It's a pretty tough unit. The training was tough and difficult. And I'm just going to let in Keisha. If you can just give me 1 second, everybody. Keisha's an honored guest, and I want to make sure she's in. Keisha, can you hear me? Perfect. And then after my time in the regular Army, I did 5 years, 6 years in reserves. And it was during that period, in between regular Army and reserve, that this thing called the Intifada, which is the first Intifada, which is sort of a Palestinian uprising, started. I was trained as a soldier, so my training was in infantry to sort of work within a war situation on a battlefield, but not what was unfolding in front of us in real time, which is sort of this popular uprising. And I'll get a little bit more into that as we move forward. But in 1989, I was out of the Army. I was working as a tour guide with the Ministry of Tourism in Israel. And I was on a bus leading a group of tourists from Canada and America. And we were heading towards the Tel Aviv area. And another bus was coming eastbound, I should say westbound, eastbound from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And my bus sort of hit the brakes, and this other bus went off the cliff. The hills of Jerusalem are very steep. It was about an 800-foot drop off the guardrail. And of course, my bus stopped, and I ran down into the ravine. And there was complete carnage. The bus had went 800 feet down into the ravine, exploded. 24 people died. And then I went to a woman who was, so I had to choose who to go to, and I went to the woman and I held her. She was not going to make it, but we had about a half an hour of this kind of conversation back and forth. She was talking to me, knowing that I would be the last person who she would ever see, and I didn't know her, of course. We found out, so I was down there for a half an hour. She died, of course, and that becomes the character Ilana in the book, which you'll hopefully read about. And once the regular Army came to kind of deal with it, slowly it started to eke out that that was actually not an accident, but it was actually a deliberate act by a young Palestinian who took the bus, who wrestled the wheel of the bus away from the driver and then took it off the cliff. And that was sort of the first, what we call a suicide act of its kind in Israel. The second Intifada was a series of suicide bombing where that really took off, but this was sort of the first. I didn't know any of this when I was down there. We just thought it was a bus accident. We had no idea what actually happened until about an hour or two later. And the irony is the actual person that took the bus off the cliff was right by my feet, next to the woman. He did not die, although that was his intention. He was taken away and eventually, about 20 years later, released in a prisoner swap. After this happened, I walked back to my apartment, which was only about a 50-minute drive, but it took me 4.5 hours to walk back. My head was sort of reeling. My shirt was completely blood-soaked, and I didn't really want to walk on the highway, so I took my shirt off, and I got back to the apartment. And I kind of symbolically, not knowing really what was going on, I mean, I knew what was going on, but just sort of symbolically put the shirt in a plastic bag, threw it away. My fiance at the time, who would be my wife, we were going to get married. We got married 4 weeks later, was there. And I was just, I guess, a little bit in shock. 4 weeks later, we got married. The family started coming. Everything got locked away. And 20 years later, 22 years later, for some reason, this all started to rush back to me. Started having weird dreams, pinwheels. I don't know what the heck the connection was with pinwheels, but one thing led to another. And then I started to realize that this incident that happened really got stored away somewhere, compartmentalized. And when it came back, I wanted to sort of bring it out to the world. I thought it would be actually good for my own self. Though I didn't really know how to write at the time, I had to learn the craft of writing, which I did very slowly and methodically. And 7 years into that journey, I knew that I was ready to craft the book called The Clay Urn. So since then, I'm sort of addicted to writing now. I write every day for about 3.5 hours in the morning. I get up at about 6 o'clock, have my coffee and write. I've had numerous pieces published, but now I'm working on my second novel called Confluence. And ironically, or interestingly enough, I shouldn't say ironically, it's sort of a natural process for writers sometimes. Ari, who hopefully you'll read about in the book, he actually reappears as a 59-year-old photographer in New York City. And he's going to be working, well, he has this serendipitous meeting with this young dancer who's living in New York and will eventually go to Quebec to kind of get away from a bad situation. Ari comes, it's a brief meeting, but it's a very meaningful meeting because he has this wisdom of a person who's been through much and will sort of mentor this, not mentor, but have a conversation that's very meaningful with this young dancer, Corey, who's the main character in Confluence. So that'll be out in 2021. So this is my third reading. I had a book launch. Again, it was supposed to be at the Book House, but we sort of reworked things. And then I had another reading at the library. So this is my third reading. And I probably will have about another 50. So to keep my own sanity in check, because I'm a person who always likes to change things up, I thought that instead of focusing today on the backdrop of the story, which is the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I'm going to focus a little bit more on my writing style. And on the back of the book, there's an amazing writer. She's also works in the film industry. Her name is Jasmine Smith. And she writes, after reading The Clay Urn, The Clay Urn is a moving portrait of life in the midst of war, poetic and visceral, with striking moments of magical realism. It's a powerful and timeless story that touches audiences with its humanity and connection. So I'm going to focus on that today. I'm going to focus on 4 very, very short pieces where I've brought in sort of this magical realism through the eyes and hands of Ilana, who is a wonderful budding artist. She's about 23 when we meet her. The book is written in 3 tenses. It starts in present tense, then it goes back to give us the story of Ilana and Ari. And Ilana, who is this incredibly creative young lady, will also tell her story in future tense through her drawings, paintings, and journaling. and will also unfortunately foreshadow some of the things that are not only a part of her life, but as I saw the Arab-Israeli conflict in a greater context as well, all done through metaphor and imagery. And then, of course, it's also told, or it goes back to present tense in the last 2 chapters, those of you who have read it. So it toggles between 3 tenses as well. So the first thing I'm going to read is a passage from the very first chapter. From the very first chapter, where we meet Ilana. It's in present tense. Ilana is living with Ari. And it kind of brings us into the world of Ilana for the first time. And we see her as she's rising early in the morning, as many artists do, to create in serenity and quiet when the sun's rising. Ilana kicks off the blanket and walks over to the patio door. Ari does not wake. She lifts a frame from the shelf and stares at the black and white photo. She is caught in lively expression. Her head rests on Ari's shoulder, her eyes wide and bright. She returns the photo to the shelf, placing it next to the clay urn. She closes her nightgown, slides the door open, and steps outside. Somewhere in the night, the dog continues to bark. There is a crack and then silence. On the other side of the stone fence, a bitch crosses the deserted street. The dog sees Ilana and moves towards her. The dog's hot breath mixes with the cool desert air. Ilana opens the gate. "Come here, sweet girl," she says. The first ray of morning light enters the small garden, casting a shadow towards the west. The bitch lays near Ilana, licking a wound on her back leg. Her right ear is torn. At a makeshift wooden table, Ilana spreads out colored pencils and a sketch pad. She draws a black dog. Blood trickles from the dog's ears, from the dog's teeth, splashing onto the barren earth. Ilana lights a cigarette. In the distance, the sun peeks over the high wall of the distant Jordanian mountains. A blanket of orange and red tumbles across the early morning sky. A curl of smoke wraps around her forehead. In the background of the picture, she draws a sea. The water is still. With a thick black pencil, she outlines Ari's body floating high above the water, his face looking up towards a cloudless sky. At the edge of the water, Ilana lies naked. Her back is curved against a large boulder. She draws a rope around Ari's waist. The end dangles near her hand. With her eyes fixed on the still water, she is casually raising her right hand towards the rope. She does not rise from the boulder and does not reach the rope. The bitch whimpers. Ilana stamps out her cigarette and runs her hand over the dog's head. "Sweet girl." Ilana leaves the gate open and climbs back into bed. Ari's body is familiar and warm. She bends her back and stretches her arm up towards the window. Ari exhales and pushes his face deeper into the pillow. So that's sort of the first introduction to young Ilana, sort of absorbing the light, taking it in. The makeshift table, which will come back through the story 2 or 3 times, this sort of temporary thing that Ari makes for Ilana to give her this small space that she could use to create in the garden that she loves so much, looking eastward towards the beautiful Judean mountains in the Judean desert. So that makeshift table will come back at the end as well. The book is written in a series of dualities, not only with the Palestinians and the Israelis or the Jewish and Muslim peoples, but the mother of Ari and the mother of Nasser, the fathers, the officers. There's all a series of dualities that come through the novel or the novella as well. So I'm going to read another short piece with this sort of mystical realism of working the story and moving it along with Ilana's interiority, her thoughts, her concepts through her, or bringing us, you as readers, into her paintings. This takes place in chapter 2. We're now with Ilana in her tour of duty, all males and females at 18 in Israel going to the military. So Ilana is now about 19 and a half. She's about a year and a half in the military. She becomes a social worker in the military. So she works with soldiers looking for cracks in their behavior to make sure that if something goes awry, if they're in a very difficult situation, that she will be there to sort of work through with them what needs to be taken care of so they can wake up the next morning and continue what they need to do. It's a very difficult, this particular unit that she's transferred to is in the West Bank. And that's where we pick up this story. She's just had a very difficult discussion with her commander, who is a bit of an SOB. He's a tough guy, but we're not sure in the end if those tough people and those tough, you know, sort of the ones who see the world through black and white are the ones who survive. So that's up for question. So here we go. So Ilana is on the base, and she's just had this very difficult discussion with her captain. And this is past tense going back. She walked quickly along the narrow path, slapped open the flaps of her tent, and slammed her canvas bag onto her cot. She inhaled, gathered her pencils, and quickly sketched Boaz's mouth and jawline. That's the captain. In his hand, he clutched a shard of broken glass. A cracked bulb dangled near his head. She leaned closer to the paper and sketched his dark blue eyes and thick eyeglasses. She inhaled and looked into the small mirror that hung from the tent's crossbars. She threw her head forward, twisting her long hair, and pinned it atop her head. Exhaling while turning the page, she sketched a sea and a distant shore. She was angry at Boaz's response and the way she accepted it all. Her mother and grandparents taught her to listen to all sides, then piece them together, but she was not prepared for situations where blood and emotions come to a boiling point. She could have explained to Boaz that a meeting could have eased the situation between the young boy and the soldier. And if it happened again, they would know how to handle it better. She drew herself floating on her back, with the sea skimming over her stomach and breasts. She sketched Boaz next to her, standing in the shallow water. He rested one hand around her back to support her body, and with the other, he moved a lock of her hair from her face and pressed his lips to her mouth. His sweet saliva mixed with the salty seawater. She tried to turn away from him and swim to the shore where Abdul Nasser's father waited on the beach, but his grip was tight. With her blue pencil, she highlighted the water and Boaz's eyes. She looked into the mirror and saw their mascot, a black and white feral cat, scamper across the dirt floor. "Hey, little kitty, where you been?" The cat jumped onto Ilana's cot and stepped slowly across her sketchbook. She meowed, sank on all fours in the middle of the paper, and closed her eyes. "You've been up to no good." Ilana slid the sketchbook from under the cat's resting body, turned the pages back to her last drawing of Boaz, and wrote down a free flow of words in the void around his face. 5:45, prepare coffee. Ready at 6, gather mail, breakfast, shower, exit tent, talk to soldiers, distribute mail, prepare more coffee, check supply list, arrange meetings, unfold maps, count night goggles, restock medical kits, order snacks, mail letters, count soldiers, wish them luck, wait for their return, count soldiers, listen to stories, make announcements, sleep, dream, shower, wash hair, dry hair, look in mirror, deconstruct machine gun, clean barrel, reassemble, look in mirror, tuck in shirt, twist hair, look in mirror, adjust machine gun strap so it's low on the hip and looks just right, look in the mirror, turn, prepare coffee, look in mirror, apply lip cream, exit tent, meet with Boaz, touch his hand, dress, wound. So one of the things that I did with that was to try to emphasize, hopefully, I mean, I try because writers only try, we only hope that the reader takes it in a way that they find it interesting. But what I try to do there is impress upon the readers that these are 19-year-old kids. And, you know, she's trying to look somewhat sexy as best she can, you know, with her hair in a certain way. The machine gun, which all Israeli women and men not only learn how to use, but also take home when they go out on leave. So if you've been there, you'll see hundreds of thousands of Israelis on buses, commuter buses, at coffee shops with their machine guns. But you know, these are young kids. And I was a little bit older. I was 22 when I went into the military and after the university. So perhaps my mind was a little bit more willing to observe and not judge as quickly as maybe an 18-year-old. And as we all know, armies are made up of 18-year-olds because our minds or their minds are still evolving or figuring things out. So it's a good time to catch them. And Ilana, in this little sort of spoken or written word piece that she writes in her journal next to Boaz's head, is interesting because Boaz is a real tough soldier and a tough commander. And yet there's still this empathy that Ilana has, not only towards him, but really towards the world in general. She's a good person. She's got a great heart. And we can't forget that on all sides, Nasser on the Palestinian side, Ilana on the Israeli side, you know, it's not black and white. So we still try to be trying to be regular people in the midst of a very, very difficult situation at times. So, and not everybody works it through like Ilana does, who herself even questions if it's people like her that ultimately don't survive. And it's people that see the world with a little bit more black and white. Maybe they're the ones. But you'll read the book and you'll find out what happens at the end, at the very end, to kind of understand how the writer myself views that. I'm going to read one last piece. So just give me 1 second. So this is the 6th chapter, the second to the last chapter. It's a short piece I'm going to read. It'll be the last piece. And here we begin to see Ilana, who after her service leaves Israel. A lot of Israelis, when they're done with their, women do 2 years. If they don't sign on for officers training, they do 2. If they sign on, they're 4 years. Men do 3 years. If they sign on, it's another 2 years. That's 5 years. So they're only getting out, a lot of them, at 23. And that's a long time for an 18-year-old, you know, to go through what they've gone through, and then they finally do get out, and they usually travel. That's why you see a lot of Israelis around the world traveling, kind of to loosen things up a little bit and see the world as many of our children have been blessed to see it, sort of in the way they want, doing what they want to do when they want to do it. So now she left Israel. She was in New York City for a year. She was working on her art, and she met a person that was very dear to her named Gabriel, who is a Nigerian artist, really talented, and sort of took in Ilana, and they had a really wonderful relationship. It is a novella, so the book goes very fast. That was done on purpose because at 21, your life is pretty quick. You don't really have time to absorb and think. And, I mean, I don't even remember much of what I did before I was 23, 24. So that's why the book was written in a novella, in these sort of impressions of their lives very, very quickly. And they move through it very quickly. So Ilana now is still in New York, but after a year, she's beginning to reassess. And then this is where we come into this 6th chapter. Ilana's readjustment back home, so she just came back home. Ilana's readjustment back home was not easy. Her time in New York gave her the distance and space she needed and the anonymity to explore her art. Knowing this freedom was temporary, she embraced every moment with Gabriel. Ilana grew fond of what they shared and felt liberated by his singular focus on the present and commitment to her personal and creative growth. It also became clear that when she returned to Israel, she would be confronted with a decision about her future with Ari. A few weeks before leaving New York, she and Gabriel took the subway to explore the ultra-Orthodox Jewish section of Williamsburg, Brooklyn. They sketched and ate sandwiches on a park bench near a busy intersection. A man with a long white beard and black hat passed by their bench and glanced at Ilana. He lingered for a moment, too long, then shifted his eyes to Gabriel. "Go back," he whispered, and crossed over to the other side of the street. Ilana sketched his face under the wide brim of his hat, and before entering the synagogue, he turned towards her. "Go back," she thought, he said again, and then disappeared through the large wooden doors. Turning the page, she sketched a rope stretched across a body of water and tied at both ends around the waist of 2 men. One she shaded darker than the other. Thick droplets of blood fell off the rope and landed in the water. Ripples spread out in concentric circles and intersected before reaching the shorelines where both men stood. In the middle of the water, Ilana floated on her back with her eyes closed. Suddenly, a car screeched to a halt at the light in front of the bench where they sat. Ilana looked up from her work as a stiff breeze pushed her hair away from her face. She closed her sketchbook and watched Gabriel's hand move back and forth over the page. The sun set behind the synagogue and cast a dark shadow across the concrete and over them. Gabriel looked up from his work. "You ready to head back?" he said in the familiar voice she had grown accustomed to. Ilana closed her eyes and let the fumes of South Williamsburg fill her lungs. She imagined herself in a white dress with an ivory floral crown in her hair, Ari moving his hand over her cheek as the setting sun ignites the limestone rocks of the Judean hills in orange and gold. You ready, Ilana? Yes, Gabriel, I am. On her flight back to Israel, she sketched a scene of an ibex on a rocky cliff with the New York City skyline in the background. So that's the beginning of the end of the end of the beginning. The next line, she's now back in New York, back in Israel, and the book returns once again to present tense. So that's sort of your three tenses. So I'm going to unmute everybody if you just give me all a second here. So you're all going to be unmuted. So there you go. So I'm just going to say one or two more words, and then I'm just going to open it up for questions. This at times was not an easy novel or novella to write. Writing a novella or a novel, those of you. Lois, I'm going to mute you, okay? Or if you, yeah, thank you. Yep. Okay. Yeah, if there's noise in your background, just mute yourself, and then this way we won't hear them. Adam?
Yeah. Hey, Paul. Sorry, there's a bit of a commotion back here, so I'm just gonna mute it for a
No
bit.
problem. So I'm going to mute everybody. So this is what hold on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute everybody. And if you have a question, just raise your hand, and then I'll open it up at the end so those on telephone can also ask questions if they would like to. And I'll put everyone back to speaker. There we go. So I was just going to say that The Clay Urn was not an easy novel or novella for me to write, because of the challenge of writing about Ilana and what will happen to Ilana. And I questioned it for about a month. I work with Erin Jones, who is a terrific novel writer, who early on saw a piece that I wrote and sort of latched on to me. She just thought that, you know, the potential was there. Let's develop this idea of your memory of this incident. And then we grappled whether it should be a novella or a novel. But when that month came over me and I said, you know, I'm not really sure if I'm ready to release anything with this subject, Erin said, well, it's not, she didn't see it as a dark novel. She actually saw it with maybe the ultimate sacrifice, but yet there's still Ari. And so I'll leave that to the reader. I do want to open it up for questions. So those of you who are on the screen, and I'll go back to unmuting those on the phone in a minute. I'm going to try to unmute. You guys have any questions that you would like to ask about anything?
Just a quick question, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Title.
Hi, Helen. How are you? Did you hear everything okay?
Yes. Just the title. I was curious.
Helen, give me 1 second. I'm going to mute everybody and I'm going to unmute you. So give me 1 second. 1 second. I'm going to mute everybody and I'm going to, okay, go ahead, Helen.
No, I was just curious. The title of the novella, The Clay Urn.
Great question. Great question. So those of you, first of all, if you, hopefully you can see that, this cover was designed by Sidney Prusso, who's a wonderful graphic designer. And I wanted something to reflect the colors that Ilana is so moved by when she comes back to Israel, the gold and the yellow and the reds that she sees in the desert. So that's where that comes from. The Clay Urn is also sort of a character within the novella. The Clay Urn actually takes on its own characteristics, and from an inanimate object, it has tremendous symbolism, because if you've read the book, and if not, hopefully you will, and Helen will work on something where I can send it to you as a vocal book, whatever they call it. I forget what they call it. So,
I have the book. I have
but
it.
you're having trouble with your eyes, so I'm going to help you out with that and read the novel and record it so you can listen to it. But with that said,
Great.
the
Thank
urn
you.
is something that Ari, when he's 8 years old, he loved going out and exploring with his dad. His dad was a really important figure in young Ari's life. And I don't want to tell you too much because you should read the book, but a terrible tragedy befalls on the family, and Ari has to figure out how to work the mysteries of the world without his dad. And that's very difficult for an 8-year-old kid who one minute is out there finding these relics, these urns and these candles, these old candle, clay candle, oil lamps and coins and all these wonderful things that we can find in Israel, in the land of Israel, because it's such an old place. And this urn that they uncover is 2,700 years old from the Israelite period. And it's symbolic because Ari brings it home and is so proud of this urn. And his mother is so proud of Ari, and as a sort of a protector of Ari's emotions, she puts it on the top of this shelf so nobody would ever knock it over, because God forbid, this is a relic and very rare. And that's the irony or the metaphor of the clay urn. Parents tried to protect us from all that's out there. And that would be really the last time that Ari will feel the full embrace of his mother, because after the tragedy befalls on the father, Shira, the wife, also enters into terrible depression and never really comes out of it. But it's not that she doesn't come out of her depression, it's that Ari begins only with his own tragedy learning how to be empathetic towards her. So the urn is critical because that is where the poetry that the father writes while he's in reserves up in the Golan Heights in the army, when he comes back, it's very difficult because when you go away on reserves, you're in the middle of being a doctor, a writer, a teacher, a baker, a store owner, and then boom, you get your call up. And in 5 days, you've got to report back to your unit. Your children are left behind, your wife, et cetera, et cetera. And then these tours are very difficult. My tours in the reserves were more difficult than my tour of duties in the regular army, because that is when the Intifada has really started to heat up. And then we'd have to come back and be like normal human beings after we saw some really bad situations. So Ari's father would get back into normal life by writing, by doing a little poetry, a little prose writing. And that would enable him, as he tells Ari, to compartmentalize his feelings and thoughts. Ari's mother will compartmentalize Ari's father's writing by putting it inside the urn. The urn is symbolic because the urn can be something where in ancient Israel, bodies could be put inside an urn. That's not the case here, but of course, the writing is put inside the urn, and I'll leave it up to you to read the book so you see what happens at the end with the urn and what Ari does. And the urn is the central figure, if you will, in this book. So that's why the clay urn. I don't know why these things come to me. If you're an artist, visual artist, writer, dancer, things just come to you and you just do it. And it's kind of like you look back at it the next morning and say, that's kind of cool. I can go with that. So I don't really write with a lot of intention, but a lot of it makes sense to me the day after or a week after, and I just keep going with it.
The writing alone.
It's a solitary art form. It's a terribly solitary art form. Sometimes so solitary that we have to get out and read our work in public, because if not, you know, it's you and the laptop, and that's all. And your worlds are created in your own head. You know, the great fiction writers, they develop these worlds in their heads. You know,
But
so
they put it on paper.
right, or paper or whatever. All right, so I'm going to ask. Hold on one second, folks. I'm going to move Helen out. Give me 1 second. Whoops, 1 second, 1 second. There we go. Helen, I'm going to mute you. Thank you so much for the question.
You're welcome. It was very, very good. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Helen. Hold on 1 second, okay? Does anybody, I'm going to unmute it. Well, does anyone else have any questions that's on the video? And then I'll unmute everyone else. Yeah. Eleanor, go ahead. Oh, hold on, Eleanor. I have to unmute you. 1 second, Eleanor. Here we go. I think this is Eleanor. Hold on, Eleanor. Here we go.
I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about how you got into writing. I know you said that this was kind of put aside. You got married, you had children, different things, and then this shocking event from many years ago kind of resurfaced in your mind, and you developed, you wanted to tell that story somehow. So is it because of the woman who you saw her just before she died? Is it that you wanted to tell her story? You asked me earlier if I write, and I write, but I don't write creatively very often. And I sometimes say to myself, I don't write because I seem not to have the story I want to tell.
Okay,
And so I'm thinking I can understand that this person shouldn't have died. She died because of a terrible, this suicide crazy guy, murderous guy.
Well, I'm not sure about that because
I mean, I think of him as murderous rather than suicidal.
okay. So let me answer your question. So I'm going to put you on mute for 1 second, and I didn't mean to. Let me put you on mute. Okay. So the question is a great question about writing, but also Ilana. One of the things. So let me go to Ilana first. One of the things, again, you have to read the book. Is I am not judging. I am not judging. This is not a political novel. I am not saying that kid is wrong. That kid is right. I'm not saying Ari is right or wrong. I'm not saying the kid that pushes, the 18-year-old kid who pushes the father of Nasser down to the ground. And if you can, any of you imagine what it would be like to watch your father or your mother get pushed down by a soldier, even something, a simple act like that, really is traumatic for a little kid. Anyway, I'm not judging. All that I'm saying is that if even at the very, very last bit, the last sentence in the novella, there's another image of a teapot, a metal teapot. Now, as writers, we never put anything in that is superfluous. We don't put things in because we have nothing better to do. So we're going to put in a teapot at the end because I don't know. I like the way it sounds. We don't do that. So the book ends with the water being boiled, and as teapots do, these metal pots, water gets pushed through the tiny hole. So Nasser, who is the character of the actual Palestinian who took this bus off the cliff, also released his steam. I'm not judging. I mean, it's a horrendous act, of course. But all that I'm trying to say, I guess, in the novel is that there's duality. There's duality. And we need to read the book to find out how I see this duality. But to answer your first part of the question about the first part of the question about how do I write the stories and so forth. So there was two things that happened very quickly, because I don't want to run out of time. I want to take a couple more questions very quickly. In the last reading, there was a young lady who joined us. Her name is Jessie Brodsky, who I have to give a lot of credit to my own development as a writer. I worked with Jessie for about 4 years, and I wasn't writing with the intention. I didn't say, well, I have to figure this out to write the Clay Urn. I was writing because there was something inside me that needed to get out a lot of stories, I think. And I wrote a very short story, very short, about this cat. Those of you who read the book, you know there's a little situation with this wonderful little cat, but it turns into a very tragic situation with this little cat. And I wrote a short story, and Jessie said, whoa, this is amazing. Like, where the hell is that from? And then I started to tell her about my past and about my service and about what I did and what I saw. And she said, you should write that, because that stuff is so real, yet you can now distance yourself from it because it happened 22 years ago. That was the first thing. And then the second thing, while I was sort of saying, well, okay, maybe I'll, work more on these stories, a series of events happened all within like a month. And one of the things was I was just kind of scrolling through, I forgot the number of the bus. It was bus 405. I couldn't remember the number of the bus. So I kind of Googled it, and there was a whole article about, of course, because this was a pretty serious incident in the annals of history and so on. And I realized that the woman who died in my hands, her sister is a very famous singer. I didn't know this. I mean, this is the first time. This was only about 6 years ago. And she actually wrote a song about waiting for her sister to come to Jerusalem to visit her. And that kind of like, so, oh my God, that's like, because again, all of this stuff was shut out for years. So then the person I was writing with said, wow, maybe you want to contact her. And I said, no, I'm not there. I can't do that. It's just not in me. So that kind of, weeks later, things started coming back to me, flooding back to me. And I started remembering all these things leading up to that, the walk back to my apartment, the flat, all these things. And then, of course, maybe there's a little bit of that, like I went to her. What if I went to someone else? What if I cradled Nasser? I wouldn't know. He was just like anyone else. Everyone looks the same. I mean, when you're mangled and bloodied, and that's the duality of it, is what I'm trying to say. I could have been with him and held him in my arms. So I guess a lot of these things started coming up in the book. You'll see what happens to Ari when he's next to Nasser, and that all kind of ties in. I have a pretty good imagination. So one thing I am is a storyteller. I've been a storyteller. Robin and Melanie, Laura and Lisa, you guys know me from years ago. Adam, you know me from years ago. I've always been good at telling stories. But now I'm able to put those stories on paper. So that gives me a little bit of the leg up on at least having stories to write. These days, these stories come flooding out to me, and the only thing I have to do is actually keep them focused, because they come out every single day. If you go onto my Instagram, you'll see every day I'm writing another short piece. Short stories I write on a regular basis, in the midst of writing 2 novels, which I'm writing now. So it just never stops. Hope that answered your question. Are there any other questions with the folks on video? If not, I'm going to open it up to the phone folks. Anyone else? Okay, so let me open it up to the phone, and we can end with that. So let me unmute everybody. So I'm just going to ask everyone to be respectful. Everyone is now unmuted. And I'm going to ask any of the people that are on the phone just to kind of jump in if you have a question. Anna, Robin, Adam, Helen, well, you want it ready? Anyone else? Robin? Mel?
Yeah, we're here. We've been listening, Paul. It's a lot of courage in taking on the material that you did, and certainly gave Mel and I food for
Thank you.
I think Mel has a bit of a question she wants to try and ask.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm just interested at the end of the book why Ari smashes the urn and doesn't give the letters to his mother.
Okay, so that is a great question. What I am going to do is I am going to mute everybody, and then I'll tell you what Mel asked, and then I'll answer the question. It's a great question, Mel. So give me 1 second. So the question that Mel asked is the second time the question was asked. So this question was asked in the book launch, and then Mel's asking again. The question is, why at the end does Ari lie to his mother, take the letters that Ari's father wrote, that Ari's mother treasured and put inside the urn? And why does he do what he does with the urn at the end? Now, I will answer the question with a question. If Ari's a kind of simple, complex character. And Ari, in the last chapter, has hit he is dealing with an intense depression based on what had happened a few months earlier. There's a good chance that people like Ari, and we all know them, will never have left that apartment again. He would have gone down the same route that his mother went down. At a moment in that last chapter, something happens to bring Ari full circle, or at least two things. A, to maybe for the first time since he was 8 years old, realize that his mother deserves some empathy, because now he's gone through it. And sometimes we don't realize ourselves that we need to help someone until that happens to us. That's number one. So now Ari's mother calls and says, maybe I shouldn't come over. And he says, no, Mom, please come over. Now, he never would have said that up until that moment. But the most important thing, Mel, and those of us, I mean, I've spent the last 12 years working with people, some who have had trauma, some who are in depression, some who are just trying to grapple with things, like we all are, with the art of writing, and how writing sometimes can not only take us on our own journey, but also heal us. Art can do that. People can do that. Friendships can do that. Having tea with an old friend can do that. Having a drink with a friend can do that. So what happens, if you notice through the book, Mel, there's little hints that Ari himself is somewhat creative. For example, Ilana, halfway through the book, says to herself, I really love the letter that Ari wrote me. The narrator is describing that the letter that Ari wrote, that was really a beautiful narrative, and she really liked getting that. But then he gave it up as his military service got more and more difficult, and the challenges, he started having this sort of curse, very black and white type of language. But then, after this terrible tragedy, he looks back at his father's letters, his own father's own poetry, and realizes that the only thing that's going to remain forever is what his dad can now give him. It's not an animate object. It's not an urn. Urns are going to come and go. They're going to shatter. They're going to break. But art, poetry, spirit, all these wonderful things that are passed down that Ari won't have the opportunity because his father left early on. Ari's going to now embrace his father's creative, literary voice. And Ari starts writing. Now, if you paid a close attention, Ari is writing the clay urn, right? Because he starts to write the first opening chapter of the clay urn, not in third person like I did, but in first person like it should have been written by Ari 22 years later after. He's going to start the novel. And so why the urn? You can hold on to your past. You can hold on to the tragedies that maybe befell you, or in a symbolic thing. I don't know a lot about other religions. I wish I did, but in the Jewish religion, you rip your shirt when somebody dies. The tradition, this is a 2,400-year-old tradition. You rip your shirt. Why? Because a shirt is something that is a prized possession. You wear it. Back then, to weave and to knit a shirt took days, months maybe. And to rip it means you're giving up on the material aspect of life. And that's what Ari's doing. He's getting rid of this thing that got stuck with his mother and saying, I now will move on. So I'm going to unmute. Mel, I hope you didn't get more than you asked for there, but I hope that answered your question.
That's good. That's good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wasn't my question, but it was a good answer.
Oh, is that Mel? I'm sorry, Mel?
You are listening to me. Yes, no, that explains a little bit more to me, but I still do not understand why he why he does not give the letters to his mother, who it's something important to her relationship with her husband. Why he would not give them to her? That seemed a little bit unfeeling to me.
So we remember, and again, I mean, certain things have to be left, unwritten, unsaid for the reader to kind of think back. But remember that every time Ari wanted to have a real relationship with his mother, really needed his mother, what did his mother do? He went for the letters. He said, Ari, I can't really talk, but let's read your dad's letters. Those letters became a block between reality and a relationship with Ari and what was in the mom's memory of her husband before he died. Got to let go sometimes. And Ari becomes that conduit to kind of say, and Ari lies. I myself had a conflicted relationship with my mother. And actually, if you notice, the book is dedicated to my mother. My mother passed away in November. And, we write about what we know. And I myself had a conflicted relationship for many years with my mother. And sometimes, the truth was maybe not told 100% to maybe make things in the long run a little bit better or whatever. What you don't know doesn't kill you type of thing. But in the end, I figured it out with my mom. And, that's why I kind of dedicated it to her. Any other questions or comments?
It's nice evening.
What's that? Well, Dej, I want to thank you for having me. Under other circumstances, it would have been different. But it's not so bad.
Hopefully we'll get you to come back, Paul.
Thank you, Helen. Nadej, thank you so much for having me and planning this.
This is great. I need to get, I do a lot of book tastings where I present gems to a lot virtually, and I need to get your book on that list. It's my next week.
You know where I am. Just reach out. I'll take care of it, Nadej. You just let me know.
I will email you separately later today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks so much, Paul.
Alyssa,
Thank you.
Bye.
Alyssa's a social worker, so I saw that.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading it. It's
Please do. Please.
hear your experience, and thank you so much for sharing your personal stories and sharing your journey with the novel. It's thrilling. It's really, really exciting, and we can see your passion behind it when you speak about it. It's awesome.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, and stay well.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.